Welcome back to the podcast. I have something really fun planned for us today. It's been quite a long time since I did a mission driven story. And today I'm going to do a mission driven story on Bess Streeter Aldrich. Now, I heard about Bess from a very good friend whose favorite book in the world is called A Lantern in Her Hand by Bess Aldrich. And so I got really curious and I climbed in and studied her biography. And I have some really fun stories to tell you. And she's just an amazing woman, born in 1881 in Cedar Falls, Iowa. And she spent her life writing stories largely about pioneers and defending the small town to the urbanization of America and teaching traditional values. And she went through some really hard things individually as well. When she wrote a little pamphlet that was to aspiring writers, she said, "Write first of all about the thing you know very best, the thing that lies closest to your heart, and write with no thought of pleasing anyone but yourself, with no thought of acceptance or rejection." And here's the rest of that advice. She says, "There's no reason why art and checks should be considered oil and water. We should write like inspired artists and sell like shrewd Yankees." Enlarging on this, she said, "The main thing is to write first for the sake of writing, what Kipling calls the joy of working, living up to one's own ideals, saying the thing he wants to say with no thought of what the trend may be or what he believes some editor wants, then find a market for the finished product when it has passed the test." And I just want to pay tribute to her. We'll talk more about, what how her writing worked and who she was and what she did. But I wanted to start with this because underneath it shows a very fundamental paradigm that she had about herself and about the world and about the way the world works. She was a very God-fearing woman. And when she talked about her craft of writing, it was an extension of who she was as a person. And the reason that she emphasizes so heavily, don't write because you think that's what other people want to hear, or you think that's what the trends are, or don't create whatever it is you're creating because of what somebody else thinks or what somebody else wants, but write from your heart the things that you know best and put your whole heart and soul into them, or create the thing, is because times will change. There are so many TikTok videos that just rise to the top and then they're gone in the blink of an eye, and that person is forgotten because they were saying something that was only relevant for that moment, or they had their moment of fame, or they were just trying to tap in. It doesn't mean you don't watch market trends. She definitely watched market trends and she sold her stuff like crazy. But she was happiest when she was writing about the things that she cared about and the things that she knew best. And it was like she said, it was for the sake of writing, for the sake of doing it, for the joy of working. And that makes her work timeless. And her books, several of her books have never even gone out of print since she passed. The author talks about how she believed that in many ways you can shape your own destiny. That was really a powerful theme in her life, that she was going to make her life what she wanted it to be. The message in her fiction was that people share the same basic human qualities. She defended values and people. She emphasized the basic sameness of people, regardless of place or position. She spoke out for the good qualities of small town, and she used work, common sense, love, and prayer. So she came from pioneering stock on both sides of her family, and there's some really fascinating stories. She was super proud of this. Her parents took the time to share their stories, especially her mother, about where her ancestors had come from. And it's even just going back one generation to her grandmother and her grandfather. There's some pretty fascinating stories. Her ancestors had come to the West and they had established towns, and they had enjoyed the small towns that they lived in. And she was very, very proud of that. So her grandfather, Zimri Streeter, came to Iowa and bought land for $1.25 an acre. And he became a leader in the area. He was a huge supporter of the new Republican Party. He defended it everywhere that he went. And he was elected to the first Iowa legislature and was very proud to have been part of the Republican Party and to get Lincoln elected. And then, of course, the Civil War broke out. And they were trying to re-elect Lincoln, and he was elected to the first Iowa legislature, and he was sent out to collect votes from the men in the Civil War. So I want to read to you a little bit about his experience. It's so fascinating. Every life has its big moment, and grandfathers came during Lincoln's campaign for a second presidential term. Governor Kirkwood appointed him to go down into Georgia, contact General Logan's 5th Army Corps, and bring back the Cedar Falls and Waterloo, Iowa soldiers' votes. He left with his flowered knapsack and arrived in Atlanta just as it fell. All communications to the north were cut, and he was bottled up with the army and had to march with Sherman to the sea. 64 years old then, he had to endure all the hardships of the march, subsisting at times on corn from the fields. But his only complaint when he returned was that he had lost his hat. That's actually a theme that Bess carries on through her books over and over again, is that her ancestors went through incredibly hard things and they just didn't complain, and they didn't want any pity. They did never have a pity party. Not that they didn't get down or discouraged, not those times weren't hard, but especially, there's this quote, I don't even know if I wrote it down later in the book, where her grandmother just said, "Don't say you feel sorry for us. We had great times in our suffering." And so here he is, they're burning Atlanta, and he's following with the Corps from the area in the middle of the Civil War at 64 years old, marching with the troops down to the sea. So incredibly unbelievable. And her grandmother, Margaret Stevens, has also just about as amazing a story. She lived with her parents in their humble cottage on the Scottish moors. And when she was 16, a young man rode up and asked for her to water his horses. And he was an aristocrat that met the beautiful, poor Scottish girl. And so this is what she wrote about the experience of her grandmother, Margaret. There were many. So after, his name was Basil Anderson, and he was a very wealthy aristocrat in Scotland. And Margaret was this peasant, this beautiful peasant girl, and he became enthralled with her. And so he would come and visit her often, and they would walk in the woods and talk. There were, quote, the people were wagging their heads and saying no good would come of it. But the young man, Basil Anderson, fell in love with and married pretty Margaret, taking her to live with his mother in the large ancestral homes. This is very much a Cinderella story, but it has a different ending. So it's very fascinating. So Basil's mother was not too pleased with the little peasant daughter-in-law, but did her best to make the girl into a lady, dressing her differently and teaching her the duties of her new station in life. When Margaret grew homesick, she would change from her finery and throw a shawl over her head, have a horse saddled, and ride across the moors to see her people. Bess had in her possession a piece of that shawl, which remains a family memento. So the older woman, Basil's mother, remained mistress of the house for 15 more years. So Basil and Margaret live there with this rich mother-in-law who doesn't really like her. They start their family, and then she dies in early 1835. And Margaret assumes the role. So now she's trying to be the good land-owning lady. And if you know much about Scotland and Ireland in the 1800s and the big landowner families and how the poor were very poor, you have a pretty good picture of what this was like for Margaret to move from kind of the bottom class to the upper class, and very difficult role to try to assume and a very different world to live in. Now, shortly after her mother-in-law's death, Basil travels to America. I guess they're thinking about relocating and moving to America. And word came that his ship had been lost at sea. And so before he left, Basil had co-signed notes for a friend guaranteeing payment on a debt. So this is where it gets really sad. So he signs on this debt for his friend. He heads off to America, and then he dies at sea. And so the notes come due. When the creditors heard the ship were gone, they closed in on the estate to confiscate it and recoup the auction signs. The recoup signs were posted on the house that its contents were to be sold. And because the horses could not be removed from the stable, they were going to be sold as well. And Margaret was pregnant with her sixth baby. So she was comfortable and well off a few minutes ago. And then her mother-in-law dies. She becomes mistress of the house. Her husband signs on these notes, takes off to America. The house is going to be, sold off, and she's going to be penniless again with 6 children. So she took 2 of the other children and walked 15 miles across the moors to get her parents to come and bid on some of her personal belongings. She or her family succeeded in buying back a set of Chelsea ware china and some blue beads, but little more because they were poor. And so she wanted a few of the things from the house, but they just didn't have the means to keep most of the stuff. After the auction, here the story gets really fascinating. So after the auction happens and she's lost everything, word comes that Basil didn't die. Unbelievable. He wasn't dead, but the information got there too late. So the transactions that were forcing Margaret and the children to leave the estate couldn't be rescinded, but Basil was safe in Liverpool and sent for the family to meet him. So she and her children and her china made their way south to Liverpool, and there they left on the wild and perilous 6-week voyage to North America. They went up the St. Lawrence River to Quebec, and in 1835, she had her baby, Mary Wilson Anderson, and Mary became Bess's mother. So Margaret went through all of this while she was pregnant with her 6th child. Then they remained in Canada for 4 years, and then they decided to try to go down in 1839 to claim some of the land that was available in Illinois. And in this trial, in this struggle, Margaret's, quote, peasant blood asserted itself. With her oldest son being 17, she became the real manager of the family because Basil was fitted for no work. He'd grown up wealthy. He'd never learned any skills. He didn't know how to build a home or plant a garden or do basically anything. And he remained the white-shirted gentleman to the end. So Margaret really basically did it on her own. She went through the whole estate sale. She trudged across the country to have her parents buy back stuff. She traveled alone with her children down to her husband, and then they crossed the ocean. And then she had to basically do most everything because he didn't have any skills. And then they went to Illinois, where she homesteaded and basically did it all herself. In 1839, Basil passed away, and after he died, she gave birth to their last child, a son. About this time, they received word from the authorities in Scotland with certain proofs that they would now be allowed to reclaim a portion of Basil's land. So not everything had to be sold to manage the debts. And so there was a little bit left in Scotland they could go back. But the family had neither the money nor the desire to return to Scotland. By 1854, Margaret having heard of the fertile soils and generous rainfalls of the new area called Iowa, some 200 miles to the west, believed it was again time to move. She was 49 years old, and daughter Mary was 18. So she goes to Illinois and she starts over and sets up her family. She gives birth to their 7th child. Basil passes away. And then when she's 49 years old, but 49 was considered really old, and she heads 200 miles west to Iowa to claim a piece of land. And her daughter, second to last child, that's Bess's mother, Mary, crosses the plains with her, heading up the team and helping them resettle and claim this land. It says that she drove one of the family's teams on the long trip from Illinois to Iowa. She would tell the happenings. So Mary, Bess's mother, would tell Bess the happenings as though there had been no hardship at all. The camping on the edge of the woods, the sound of the night winds, the odors of the prairie grass, all these she pictured so clearly that I could almost see and hear and smell them myself. It's really important, I think, to understand these incredible stories on both sides of her family. Through her father's side and her mother's side, she was raised on them. They meant a great deal to her. She internalized them. And the champion pioneer women that did such incredible, difficult things and did them with a good attitude had such a huge impact on her and totally shaped the way that her values and her faith and her character and her visions of goodness and greatness. She loved and honored the sacrifices of her ancestors. She shared them all her life, the amazing things they'd done, how pioneering had shaped them, the difficulties they'd endured with pride and humor, shaped her perception of the world and built her character. Bess herself was the last of 8 children. So by the time she came around in 1881, her father was 55 and her mother was 46. So she had a lot of bosses, a lot of older siblings. One of her sisters was like 26 years older than her and was kind of like a mother and a sister and a friend to her. They had a really comfortable home. It was of no architectural style. And these themes, these ideas are reflected over and over again in her books. One year when I think she was like 7 or 8 years old, they received a piano and it was like just a huge moment in her life. And she started playing. She absolutely loved it. It became a part of her life. So there were a lot of people running around the house kind of telling her what to do, but there were a lot of hands to do the work. There were a lot of older siblings and house help. And so she did chores and she was helpful, but she loved to read at a very young age. And so she would often slip a book under her apron and volunteer to go upstairs and make beds so that she could have long periods of time undisturbed to read. She loved to help in the yard. The flower garden was a big part of her life. She loved to play and create stories. She did a lot of that. And gardening and reading were a lot of how she spent her childhood outside of school. They were devout Presbyterians. And I want to tell you a little bit about a couple funny stories from when she was in high school, just because these little anecdotes say a lot about what the world was like then. You know, I'll tell you more about this in a minute, but one of her books was eventually made into a movie, the only one, and that was really heartbreaking to her. And I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. But there's some things that were said. I'll just tell you about it in a minute, what was said in that movie, because when you watch these movies, 1941, it was only 80 years ago. And oh man, the world was just so different. It's just so amazing how different things were. So, okay, so one of the things, she lived in this town because her mother had helped homestead in Iowa. She grew up in Iowa and the town had been growing, for 30 years or so as her family had been living there. But they had these local town events, such as the yearly excitement of the commencement program at the Teachers College. So there was this local college. She ended up attending school there later on. And what they would do every year at graduation time was a 3-day activity in which the townspeople took lunch baskets and picnicked on the campus, and student orations were mingled with student acted Shakespeare plays. This was a dress-up affair, which meant the other dress was brought and donned, and the width of your hair ribbon established your social status. Bess's world consisted of going to school, winter bobsledding, school debates, the joys and embarrassments suffered under one guise or another by all children, and the beginning of friendships that would last a lifetime. So this event was super incredible. Everybody in town would pack a lunch and go early in the morning and listen. Every single student would give an oral presentation and they would act out bits of Shakespeare. It was amazing to me in the late 1800s and into the 1900s how huge Shakespeare was. Like in my liberal arts education, I learned early on that the Bible and Shakespeare were the books in every home. When I first learned, I was like, oh yeah, it's kind of a trite little fact, but those Shakespeare and the Bible shaped the way that people saw the world, their value system. The virtues were so deeply entrenched in those writings. They were the unifying books of the nation until until 1930, 40, 50. And they started to, and then I guess it was the late 60s, 70s that Bibles were taken out of schools. And so the Bible and Shakespeare shaped this nation. And it was still very much a stronghold in the late 1800s. And Shakespeare was read all the time. And Shakespeare plays were acted out. And it was a huge part of what they did in school. Bess was an outgoing individual, active in many extracurricular high school events, including athletics, cooking, and Shakespeare. So this is a story that she told. I'm going to tell you a couple of these funny stories from high school. They say a lot about the time. Okay, so this is one of her memories from high school. None seems funnier to me now than the time that basketball was introduced. So this is like right at the turn of the century. Basketball is this new sport. The game was very new, and there were 9 on a team. We had practiced in the old gymnasium, and then someone decided the game should be played outdoors. So from the beginning, there was a women and men's team, or they were co-ed, I'm not sure. So they decided that they needed to play the game outside. And when the word trickled forth that we were actually to play outdoors in bloomers, so the women had bloomers under their skirts. And it was just considered immodest for the bloomers to show. So I think it was that there was a women's team and they could play basketball, but they practiced in these bloomers and they couldn't go outdoors where the whole world could look on. There were many and sundry discussions and shaking of heads concerning the moral and ethical aspects of this great venture. This is just barely over 100 years ago. Each pair of bloomers contained 6 yards of wide flannel that, when raised to the side, would form a fan-shaped mass of dry goods as high as the shoulders with no visible sign of parting. They were trying to make these girls so modest that they basically created bloomers that they weren't a skirt because they had legs, but they were like a skirt. And if you lifted them all the way up, they would come to your shoulder and just fan all the way out because there was so much fabric. So funny. She belonged to the Shakespeare Club and did other activities, but there was this other funny story that I wanted to share that she shares. She was in a Shakespeare class, or just in an English class. There were 200 students in the high school, and in her senior class, there were 33 students. The teacher was Grace Norton. Small, Eastern, and old when she moved to Cedar Falls, and unchanged years later, Miss Norton was formidable. Aldrich writes of an occasion when the senior Shakespeare class was reading Hamlet in a study hall for want of a better place. Other students in the hall were whispering and rustling papers, and Miss Norton wanted no distraction for her class. Bess was Hamlet, and she had just read, "Never to speak of this that you have heard. Swear by my sword." Clyde Parks, the ghost beneath, responded, "Swear." Abruptly, Miss Norton turned to the restless juniors and sophomores, took off her glasses, and gave one of her famous acrid lectures about not making disturbances when others were working. She stopped. The silence was awesome. She turned back to the players and told them to continue. Bess Streeter heroically declaimed Hamlet's very next line, "Well said, old mole." The room full of students erupted with laughter, and even the redoubtable Miss Norton joined in. So funny times, but very different times. They got in trouble for talking in study hall when the senior class was trying to read Hamlet. When she was 14, she entered a writing contest in the Chicago Record, and she won a camera. And this is what she said about it. "It was then when I first tasted blood, for the intoxication of seeing my name in print was overwhelming." She wrote for the high school yearbook, and later during high school, she entered another writing contest and won 5th prize. So even in her high school years, she had a tendency toward literature and writing. And because of these couple of awards that she won, she was very highly encouraged in her writing. She graduated from high school in 1898 and enrolled in the college beginning that fall. She lived at home while attending college and daily walked the 4-mile trip to and from classes. So this was really fascinating. All her life, Bess wanted her, so she became a very prolific short story writer, and I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And then later she wrote novels. But one of the dreams was to have one of her stories or novels made into a movie. And so she was constantly trying to make that happen. She wrote to Hollywood and visited Hollywood a lot of times throughout her life. And there were a lot of occasions when it almost happened, and they would get really far in a contract, or they would say really encouraging things, and then it wouldn't happen. But finally, in 1941, a movie was made of her book, Miss Bishop, which is called Cheers for Miss Bishop. And actually, I'll put a link in the description because you can watch it for free on YouTube, which I did recently. It's the story, it's celebrating teachers. And it's about a woman who never marries and is a teacher all her life. And because teachers aren't paid very well, she was worried about retirement and discouraged about going into retirement and felt like she was kind of pushed into retirement. And then they have this celebration celebrating her life and all of the lives that she'd touched and the many students that she'd helped in a myriad of ways celebrated her. And so that's the story of the book. The romantic side takes a little bit more front and center in the movie, but it's just full of these rich traditional values. And the way that they talk about education, the way that they talk about teachers is so different. And I, on this podcast, in the courses that I've built, in the things that I've done over the last couple decades, I know sometimes I sound old fashioned or just very traditional, or, like I'm not up with the times, but I'm trying to convince you and everyone that listens that I'm not just making this stuff up. Like, I'm just in these original sources and I'm telling you the virtues that America was founded on, the way that education was seen. I haven't said anything about this yet. It's coming. We're working on it, but we're building a history of education series that's going to start coming out this fall. Super excited about it. And so the more we're in these older documents, the more we see this unified idea about the purposes of education. And it was just so great. Came up again in reading about Bess Aldrich and about just watching this movie from 1941, because the nation believed these things 80 years ago and made a movie about them, about the glory of education and the purposes of education. And I'm not just making this stuff up. We've distorted it. We've turned it into career training. And that's not what education is supposed to be. I'm on a bit of a little tirade here, I know. But I just feel so passionately about it. And it matters. It matters because even for homeschoolers or private schools or charter schools, there's often, just as an aside, and I'm going to talk more about this in a couple months when we launch this history of education series and I talk about the different things that we're going to go over. I have a good friend who's trying to help found a classical liberal arts charter school in her area. And she has gotten so much kickback from the local ISD. And, one of the things that's been so incredibly eye-opening for both of us as we've talked about her experience in this journey for the last couple of years is how much the head of this ISD has talked about, you can't talk about virtues in school. You can't even talk about values, which aren't even as high and noble as virtues. His argument is everybody has different values, so you can't even talk about it. And if you can't unite people around any values whatsoever, what in the world does education mean? It means nothing more than bare facts and information. And that doesn't help anybody because that information can be looked up. That doesn't sculpt the person. That's not education. And it's been so disheartening for her and I, as an onlooker, to just see how much things have changed in just 80 years about what education is and what it means and why it matters and how we do it. And so it's so different. So in this movie, so there's this scene almost at the beginning of the movie. And the protagonist, I think her name is Ella, is Miss Bishop. And she's running into the college the first day of school. And she didn't have her money, so she had to go back and get her money. So she's running late. So she's walking in after this kind of opening meeting of the students and the faculty has begun. And the principal is talking to all the students. Or the president of the college is talking to all the students. And as she comes in and sits down, this is what he says. I know some of you have walked miles to get here. And every day for 4 years, you'll have to walk those miles through rain, sleet, and snow. And what I love is knowing about Bess Aldrich that she actually did that. She actually walked 4 miles every single day for 4 years to attend college because this mattered to her. And it was through rain and sleet and snow. So the president goes on, but I know that in the end, this will pay off. Let's see, I know this education will pay you for those hardships because the end of education is wisdom. Wisdom is first cousin to freedom, and freedom is the glory of our nation and our people. And then he says, let us pray. And Bess is just speaking about her experience. She's just telling about what happened to her when she was a college student, that she walked miles and she went to school, and that the purpose of education was wisdom, and wisdom perpetuates freedom, and freedom is the glory of America. And she then has this protagonist go home and repeat these words to her mother again with great admiration. And it sets the tone for this movie with the focus on the glory of learning and the value of good teachers to build character and wisdom. And this was right from her very own experience and the values that she wished to perpetrate and inspire in her readers and in the watchers of this movie. And the movie was super popular. People loved it. And it made good money, and it had really, really, really great reviews, and it was shown all over the country because this is what the nation believed in 1941. This is who we were. That hardship was important, and that hardship would pay off, and that education should make you a wise and good person. So after she graduated, she moved a lot of different places to teach school. She went further west, even out to Utah. She wrote stories and had them published in the Young Citizen. She wrote about everyday things, but was always trying to be interesting and inspiring. I want to read really quickly to you about how she met her husband, because this is a really sweet story. And then I'll tell you a little bit about her husband. So she had gone to a boarding house in Marshalltown where she was teaching, and she was there with a friend who also taught school in Marshalltown, lived and boarded in a stately remodeled old home called the Robin's Nest. There were 2 dining rooms at the Robin's Nest. This is at the turn of the century, just barely over 100 years ago. And the mores of the Victorian era, which had a great influence on rural areas at the time, recommended that one dining room be used for the ladies and the other for the gentlemen. So they didn't even have, obviously there were plenty of places where men and women ate together, but in this boarding house, it was very kind of old fashioned, and they had different dining rooms. However, occasionally the numbers were not evenly divided. And so it happened that at one dinner, the men's dining room was filled. Thus, 2, quote, dashing and handsome young men were sent to eat in the women's dining room. Miss Streeter, watching their approach, turned to her friend and murmured, Lola, there's one for each of us. Just as the men arrived, they were introduced as Captain Charles Sweetser Aldrich and Mr. Frank Harridan. Bess's comment was prophetic, for Bess would marry Aldrich and Lola would marry Harridan. So I thought that was really cool. Her husband, Charles Aldrich, was an amazing guy. I'm going to tell you really quickly about him. He was also from a family of pioneers. He came from a huge family. I think there were 13 kids. He attended the University of Iowa, and he was a leader on their football team. He then went on to law school and opened his own law practice. But that wasn't enough. In the evenings, he volunteered to organize and train a group of Marshalltown area men who became infantry volunteers. And After they were trained, they were called to duty in the Spanish-American War, where he became one of the youngest captains and known to be a good officer. There's this really sweet excerpt in the book where it talks about how he was always taking blankets to his men and visiting them and watching out for them and asking what he could do for them. He was just incredibly service-oriented and cared about people and very accomplishment-oriented, but always doing really great things. He served in Cuba. He became really ill. They thought he was going to die, but he lived. After the war, he realized that attorneys would be needed in the Alaskan gold fields. So he went out to Alaska. He was super adventurous. And he and Bess were both, it's so interesting because they were such high achievers and they weren't afraid of a challenge. They weren't afraid of hardship and they weren't afraid of new things. But eventually they settled in a small town because they wanted the small town life. So interesting. Anyway, so he was an attorney by day, and in the evenings, he organized a literary society that met and discussed books, which became so popular that often there wasn't enough room for everyone. In 1903, after 3 years in Alaska, he accepted an appointment as U.S. Commissioner and moved to Candle, Alaska, a town above the Arctic Circle. So incredible. But the next year, his father died, so he went home. He settled his father's estate and returned to his law practice in the area. And Bess Streeter was in the area teaching, and they met. They courted, and she described him as the most admirable and attractive man I have ever known. They had a lot of mutual interests like literature. Their courtship was full of laughter, good talk, and fun. They attended church together. They read Shakespeare together, to each other, and together they followed the strict rules of courtship. Then Charles was offered a 1-year post as commissioner back in Alaska, but in the meantime, Bess had an offer from her sister to travel with her, I think, to Utah for a year. And this was the sister that was older than her that had been like a mother to her. And Bess didn't want to miss out on this opportunity. So they became engaged and then they split up for a year. And then they came back together to marry. So they were engaged for almost 2 years by the time they married. Just before they were going to get, a few months before they were going to marry, Bess's father died and unfortunately couldn't see her wed, but they thought about postponing the wedding to grieve longer and then decided against it. They were married in September 1907. And in the meantime, she's still writing short stories. And she would periodically get one published. And then she started to be paid. So she got a story published called The Madonna of the Purple Dots. And they were offering $5 for it, but they sent her a $10 check and said, this is better than $5. So we want to pay you $10. So she's still doing this and being encouraged. And this is kind of her sideline. She teaches and writes and does all these good things. They marry and they have these close friends, the Cobbs. And after lots of conversations with the Cobbs, they just decided, we really want to raise our family in a small town. We love the culture of the small town where everyone knows each other and watches out for each other. And Bess was really an advocate for the small town. It was an age where people were flooding to the cities and industrialism was really taking hold. And it was harder to find work and make a living in small towns sometimes, but also a lot of the younger generation felt like that the small towns they were just kind of old school. They were boring. They wanted the excitement of city life. And so there was a lot of like talking negatively about small towns, and Bess was constantly defending them and felt like they were just a really great way to live and to raise your family. So these husbands, both these families wanted to be in a small town. So the men traveled around looking for the perfect spot for them to settle. And they decided on Elmwood, Nebraska, and they purchased a bank there, the American Exchange Bank. Even though there was this bank, it was still a very small town. So they moved there. And well, first she gave birth to their first child, a son, and they were separated for a little bit while he was getting things arranged. And he bought this little cottage in Elmwood. And Bess had this moment where it was kind of like being a pioneer. It was her first experience of, wow, I'm going to move far away and leave all my people and not see them very often and have to write letters and be a little bit on the frontier. And they weren't starting from nothing, but it was difficult. They arrived. So she comes out to meet Charles. She misses him. She wants to be with him. So she travels with their newborn son. And when she shows up in Elmwood, it's this dust storm, which is terrible. Every single thing is covered with dust, and she can't see the landscape very well. She can, as they're going from the station towards the house, like she can barely see the house because of all the dust. And then as she sees the cottage, it's just this small little house. She knows it's theirs because the rocker that she got for a wedding present is broken sitting on the front porch. So it's kind of like it was hard to make the sacrifice to go there. It's kind of discouraging how she shows up. And then she says this about the experience. She later wrote, she walked into the house after being in this storm and being separated from Charles and traveling all this way. On my own stove and with my own dishes, a neighbor had prepared a delicious meal for the strangers, for them, that they might feel welcome. Bess recalled that she had experienced it 1,000 times since, the warm-hearted hospitality, loyal friendship, and deep sympathy of the small town. And it is these characteristics and others of the better features of the small town and its people that I have tried to stress in my short stories and books. So there they were, settled in Nebraska, and she took back up her writing. Eventually, she wrote a short story for a contest, and the contest didn't finish going. Like they canceled the contest for some reason, but the journal that had put on the contest read her story, and they sent her a check for $175. And this is what she said about that moment. She said they sent her a check for $175. She said, I was wild with delight, but her mother looked at it and said, it must be $1.75. I looked, but there wasn't a sign of a decimal point in that figure. She said, that proved it. I could write. I had arrived. It was all very, very lovely. How easy. Just a few afternoons of writing. So I sat down and wrote another story, much better than the first. Already I had the second check mentally invested. It would probably be for $200 this time. It was like a slap in the face when the story came back. So she sent it in and people didn't want it. I began trotting out all the excuses that disgruntled writers use. I felt sure that the editor himself had not read it, but it seems he had read it. The letter said so, and right then and there I received my lesson that you have to work to be a successful writer. Just as you have to work to be a successful groceryman or a successful anything else. Writing is sheer labor. She has experience after experience. I mean, this woman was relentless. She was successful because she sent in she would believe in a short story, she'd send it to 20 plus publications sometimes. And even then, sometimes it still wouldn't get published. But she was just relentless in pushing her writing. She just didn't give up. And that's the reason she was so successful, is because she wrote and wrote and wrote, and she sent it in and sent it in and sent it in. She was willing to take the rejection. She was willing to do whatever, to pay whatever price need to be paid to sculpt and hone her skills. A little bit later, she entered another contest and she won 5th place out of 5,000 people. So she keeps having it affirmed to her that she's a better writer than other people. She's actually good at this. And so she keeps writing. But even though she got that check for $175, some years, I think that was 1911 that happened. And some years, like in 1913, she only made $79. And so here she is. She's 32 now when her 3rd child is born. And she's a full-time mom with 3 kids, but she's also helping to establish Elmwood. So she helps start the first women's club, and she's the first president. She helps found the first library. She writes for the local paper. She's a devoted friend and neighbor. She's a full-time mother, wife, friend, heavily involved in the town, and yet she's still finding time to write her short stories. And this is kind of, to me, one of the most important messages I want to get across in the mission-driven story about her and about you and I is just don't give up. Be relentless. Take the lead from Bess Aldrich. Like, look at her example. The rejection was constant, but there were little breaks of success. In some years, she would only publish 3 or 4 short stories, but she was constantly writing. She said it would take 3 or more weeks to write a story. And then she had to send it out and, pay for the postage and wait for the rejections to come back and send them out and send them out and send them out, right? She kept honing her skills. She took correspondence courses in to hone her writing skills. Editors would come back with feedback for her, and she would take it seriously and try to fix the stories and try to get better at her writing. She was very serious about being good at this. And her husband was a good provider. He was an attorney. He ran the bank. And eventually they built a bigger home. They were comfortable, and she had the freedom to be able to write as a hobby for a long, long time. But she was so consistent about it. And I'll talk about this in a little bit when I talk about A Lantern in Her Hand, because I loved that book, but I also had kind of one little piece of contention about it. And it has to do with the incongruence between her own experience and what she says in this book. But she had a lot of these obstacles. I want to read to you a couple things that she said about this time in her life and her experiences at this time. She says, publications proved she was slowly achieving the success for which she strove. However, while some stories were selling, many still came back with the familiar rejection slips. Enough, she said, to fill an old-fashioned bed tick. That means hundreds and hundreds. However, I wrote story after story, beginning a new one soon after each one had been sent out. Finding the time to write cannot have been easy, for she was fulfilling the social responsibilities of a banker's wife, mothering 3 active children with a 4th on the way, participating in church activities in the women's club, and doing much of her own housework, and preparing meals at a time when there were few shortcuts. All the while, she continued writing and rewriting her stories, corresponding with editors. Indeed, she corresponded so often with some that one noted that she seemed almost like one of the staff. That was all right with Bess Streeter Aldrich. She was doing the thing she wanted to do. So she persists year after year after year. She has her 4th child. And she talks about the challenges there as well. She also described working in a spare bedroom that, according to her plan, was to be her private writing room. However, her husband began keeping his newspapers and law magazines in there. Her daughter housed a doll family under the desk, and her sons tucked kite strings and tin soldiers in the desk's pigeonholes. Thereupon, she wrote, I decided that my writing, at least, could never be separated from the family life. An editor asked that she write her personal story so that readers could get to know her better, and she did more. She wrote her article to show readers that they could shape their own lives and could do what was important to them as she had done. She wrote that she had found time in the past few years to write and sell nearly 60 stories while raising my babies and doing a great deal of my own housework. Under the title, How I Mix Stories with Donuts, appeared a quotation from the article reflecting her philosophy. People are always telling what they long to do more than anything else in the world. If they really did, they would go ahead and do it, because you can always find time for the thing you most want to do. And she proved it with her life. They were establishing this new small town. She was helping to found places. She was going to meetings. She was helping run the church. She was showing up at social events and putting on social events and keeping her house clean. And, housework was far more laborious, washing things by hand and ironing by hand. And she just found a way. It was important. That was what she did in any spare moment she could find. And what's cool is that eventually it paid off. With her husband's income increasing, this is what eventually happened. After she had her 4th child, this is what she was able to do. She wrote a letter to her friend, Grace Bailey, and explained what her life was like at Christmas in 1921. So now it's 10 years later. She's been writing since high school. So It's been 15, she's in her mid 30s at this point with 4 children. She's been writing for close to 20 years. She's been married and actively using her spare time to write and get stories published for 10 years. And she finally gets to this point where she's kind of arrived. And she says this: am in the writing business so thoroughly now that I don't even do all my own mending. I have my housework arranged just fine now. Keep my Gussie Rosenvetter, this is a woman that she hired all the time for cleaning dishes, ironing, etc. Then my next door neighbor does part of the baking. She's a dandy cook, and all I have to do is call her up and say, I want a crock of beans and a pie and 2 dozen rolls, and they come over looking so lovely. Then Gussie's sister takes a basket of mending home with her. Another woman does the sewing, and I have all my own clothes and Mary's from the ready-made. Now, I know you're wondering what there is left for me to do. Well, to tell the truth, I do have it lots easier now than when I was just trying to get in the magazines and do my work too. Right after breakfast, I get my dinner ordered and do something in the cooking line toward it myself. Then I get the children all off to school and Gussie's work laid out. And then Bobby and I go in the writing room and I work for several hours at my desk while he plays with his things. After dinner, when he has had his nap, I put in a couple more good hours of work at the desk and then shut it up and take Bobby out in his cart or go to club or a Kensington or something. I make so much more money at the writing that I pay out to hire this work done that of course it would be foolish for me to plan it any other way. And with these people all working for me, it keeps everything up nicer and cleaner and going along more smoothly than if I tried to do more. So this is the really cool arrangement that she's created for herself by turning her hobby professional. And she didn't share it out with her friends. I keep thinking of this book. I'm not going to do a podcast or anything on it, but it's called The War of Art. We're having a family discussion on it tomorrow, actually. And it reminds me a lot of the kinds of things that he talks about in that book about whether you're an amateur, act like an amateur or a professional in the thing that you love to do. And acting like a professional means that you show up every day, you do it no matter how you feel, you take it seriously, and you expect to get paid for it. And it's not something that you hope to just get inspiration. Like she had a schedule. She sat down and did her work and she expected to be paid for it. She sent in these short stories and she expected them to be published. And a lot of them were never published. And she didn't always get paid what she wanted to get paid, but she had done it for so long and for 10 years, pretty hardcore. So she could get to the point where she could do it professionally. And then her children would come home from school and she had it arranged so that she was there for her son and giving him what he needed. And then the other children were at school. And then when they came home, she was all theirs. She read to them every night. They read the Bible regularly. They read all kinds of stories and books and she helped them with their homework, whatever the situation was. She was there entirely for her family. And so, motherhood and mission. That's what Mission Driven Mom Academy is all about, being able to do that. She champions motherhood and she is the mother. It's so cool because she doesn't just write about how meaningful it is to be a mother. She is the mother that is the hero of her own story. It's just really, really cool. So eventually she had written this Mother Mason series and the magazines had loved it and she wanted to put those into a book. And so she had to do some convincing, but she was able to compile the Mother Mason stories. And I think this book is still in print too. I think you can still get it. And it was finally published in 1942. And by that time, she had been married with children, writing, receiving hundreds of rejections, and publishing short stories every year for 13 years, not including what she'd been doing since she was 14. And so she really paid a price to do that. In 1925, she published her first novel, The Rim of the Prairie, which took 15 months of full-time writing. She did a lot of homework. She made sure she was always very meticulous about times and dates and places. And so she would fictionalize the characters and turn it into a very fascinating story, but she would lean into real facts and instances. And so it was kind of historical fiction to a large degree. So it was an immediate bestseller. It was lauded by some critics as among the greatest books ever written, and speaking engagements began to come in. I wanted to read you this little excerpt of what it was like for them at this time. She's busy doing all these things. Her husband is busy in the town as well. Her deep love and respect for her husband came through. She memorialized her husband through a character in this Rim of the Prairie story and talked about him. During the period that Bess was writing this book, Cap, they called him Cap because he had been a captain, Charles, was an attorney, cashier, and partner in the American Exchange Bank in Elmwood. No one is capable of measuring the influence on a community of a man like her husband. Placed as he is, with his hand on the financial pulse of the people, his position is one of physician to the various businesses. He is also a combination teacher, preacher, lawyer. Aldrich's recognition of the banker's importance to the community was verified by townspeople. It was Cap Aldrich who made the speeches at important events like Memorial Day and 4th of July, who helped organize the Chautauqua, who arranged for bank loans for those with collateral or personal loans for those without. One longtime resident of Elmwood commented that Mr. Aldrich was a good neighbor to all of the people in the town. He helped everyone every way he could. So they are very, very much one of the important backbones or founding families of this town. They have a pulse on everything, and they are incredible people who are involved in all the things and making everything happen. And he's just is such an important person to the community. And she really talks him up through this character in this book that she writes. And then tragedy strikes. So just after this book is written, the headlines of the Elmwood Leader Echo read, C.S. Aldrich passed away very suddenly, died listening to service Sunday morning at 11:45 at church. His passing was almost instantaneous. The newspapers of the time declared the cause of death was heart attack, but it actually had been cerebral hemorrhage. He was 53 years old. So there was nothing wrong with him. And they had such a happy family, such a happy home, such a happy marriage, and things were going so well. This tells you a little bit about how important he was. It was reported that short services were conducted from his residence at 2:00 Tuesday afternoon, after which services were conducted from the Methodist Church at 2:30, which would not hold everyone who came. The newspaper noted that all business in town was suspended from 2 to 4 p.m. and the schools were closed for the afternoon. So he was so important that everything was closed so that everyone could go to his services. At the time of his death, he was in his second term as president of the school board, served on the city board, on his church board, as a teacher and the superintendent of his church's Sunday school, as an organizer and treasurer of the Chautauqua, as vice president of the State Bankers Division of the Nebraska's Bankers Association, and as a member of the Spanish-American War veteran, the Odd Fellows, the Modern Woodmen, and the Masonic Lodge. He had been asked to run for governor, but had declined to do so. Bess's sense of loss was immense. And it was hard for her not to get angry and resentful that theirs had been such an extremely happy home. She said about it that, I used to tell myself that someday I'd have to have my share of trouble because other people had them and things had gone a little too well for me. Well, I've had it. I know what trouble is now. She said, we've gone right back to church and sat in our own pew where he died. He died in their pew during church on Sunday. And I went right back to the Missionary Society and the Kensingtons. I knew if I stayed at home and mourned, it would just be that much harder. And I've just taken up my life as best I could. I have my children to live for, and I'm not going to allow their lives to be unhappy. I'm mighty glad I have my talent for writing because it's going to be bread and butter for us. There must have been a guiding hand in my taking it up while the children were little. Cap was proud of my writing, but there's nothing to do now but go on. They'd been good with their money. They'd lived good financial principles. And so they had some insurance and some stock. And then she said, but of course, with 4 children, and especially that I want them to go to college, it's going to take some faithful work on my part. Writing is what she knew. She had immersed herself in it for so long. She understood how to make money on it. She had one successful novel under her belt, and she knew that writing was going to have to pay the bills. And in that day and age, you paid for your own college if you went. She wanted all of her kids to have a college education like she'd had. And I think I didn't mention this. I think she even went on to get a master's degree. But that was really important to her. And so she was going to have to fund it. She was going to have to pay the bills and get all her children through college and be a single mom. She had the town support and she had her writing and all of her connections. And so she just dove in. She said that she drew great strength from her strong religious faith and leaned on God immensely. And it drove her faith even deeper through this hard time. For about a year, she put her life back together and they had some of the money set aside. And so she was able to get by. But she knew that she needed to take back up her writing. Over a year after, she wrote a short story again. An idea came and she wrote it and they sent it out. And she and her oldest daughter, Mary, I think she was late high school by this time, maybe 17 or 18. And she and Mary would go to the post office twice a day to see if there had been any word. And so one afternoon, Mary walks to the post office and she gets notice that it's been bought. And she is so thrilled. She runs all the way home and all the way through town, waving this letter, and arrived home excitedly, told the family that she had been paid $600 for this short story, and they all celebrated. She knew that novels would provide better income than the short stories, and so she decided she was going to write another novel. Oh, one really kind of cool thing is the McClintocks had the magazine McCall's. Her and the McClintock, I can't remember. And she had written several short stories with them and the editor, and she became friends. She became a friend of the family. They invited her out to their cabin. And eventually they gave her some land that adjoined hers for her own summer cabin. And then her boys built her a cabin on the property, which is really, really sweet. So she'd go there in the summers. But by 1927, she'd sold over 100 short stories and written 2 novels. And now she decided to work on her book, which is this is the one that my friend told me is her very favorite book, A Lantern in Her Hand, probably the most enduring and popular, although she did some novels and then she did some collections of short stories. The collections of short stories didn't do as well, but all of the novels made it onto bestseller lists. She was very meticulous. She took her time. She had to have it perfect. And when she decided to write this novel, she had been invited to be on a radio spot, to be interviewed on the radio, which was kind of a new thing and weird for her. And so when she went on the radio, she kind of told this, that she, about herself, I don't know, answered whatever questions they asked. And near the end, he was like, well, is there any new work coming out? And she said, yes, I'm going to write a novel about pioneer women. And if anyone has any stories about pioneering from their families that they want to share, then they could send them to me as long as I have their permission to use whatever they send me in my book. And so she just got that verbal permission. If you send me something, just know I might use it. And she got thousands of letters coming in with all this information and lots of cool stories to share. And so this book honors pioneer mothers. It follows the life of Abby Deal from the time that she's 8 years old until she's 80. She travels with her family as a child, and then she travels with her husband to Nebraska to help settle Nebraska. She's talented and vivacious and has all these aspirations. And she endures all these hardships of being a wife and a mother on the frontier and as a pioneer. And really, when I was reading this, it was like, and then another hard thing happened, and then another hard thing happened. It was just relentless. And I don't know if that's how it was. She was very meticulous and true to the historical accuracy. But she was very, very nervous to write this novel. She wasn't sure if she could get it right. She didn't know how it would be received. But of course, like knowing the stories of her ancestors, how much she loved them, how much she wanted to champion them. And even though she'd had success in the world at this point, it was still being a mother that was her greatest accomplishment, that she was the most proud of. So she really wanted to honor these pioneer mothers. So she gathered all these thousands of letters and pieces of information. And for 14 months full time, all she did was wade through them and found her favorite anecdotes and checked in on all the historical documents to make sure she had everything right and built out an outline and a timeline for the book. And once that was done, she sat down to write and wrote full time for 5 months. She gets everything organized. She puts all her files complete with dates and details that follow her from her child, this woman, Abby Deal, through her 60 years in Nebraska. And then, filled with anticipation and humility, Bess sat at her desk. She later would recall the moments spent in focusing and tightening her concentration before she began. Remembering, she wrote on the back of a piece of notebook paper. This is what she wrote that happened that morning that she sat down to actually write the book. I began my work at 10:30 on a sunshiny morning on November 1st, 1926. The first thing I did was to pray for strength, guidance, and a little of the divine spirit without which I would be nothing. I prayed that if possible, all those I love who have gone on might be allowed to bend over me for a moment with words of encouragement, because Abby's ancestors were going to be her ancestors. She was going to tell the story of her ancestors through this novel. So she wanted those that had gone on before to be with her. Then I opened Daily Food and read what was set apart for November 1st and said, Thou, Lord, wilt bless the righteous. With favor wilt thou compass him as with a shield, and he that walketh uprightly walketh surely. It is in this spirit that I begin my book. So that was such a beautiful insight into who she is. And even though she'd had a bestseller, she still felt so humble approaching this story. She wanted to do her ancestors justice, and she knew that her family's welfare was depending on the quality of her work. And before, she'd had the freedom of just writing for the joy of it, but now the idea of making money was an added stress, and she just wanted God to be there with her. It was instantly popular. It was on the bestseller list. And for many years, it was listed on the top 100 books to learn about America. Lots of lists had those. If people were coming into the country or in classrooms for children to learn about the history of America, this was recommended as one of the top 10 books to do that. It was translated into many languages and was popular all over the world. And this is so, to me, a bit of a tragedy. I've got thousands of books, and I've been collecting books for 25 years and reading them, and I've looked on bestseller lists, and I'm still uncovering people like Bess Aldrich, who I still have not heard of, and who were famous just 100 years ago. And this is when it really struck me, the injustice of how her books have been now ignored and taken out of our school systems while others have not, because this and other of her novels competed with Pearl Buck and Willa Cather for popularity in the early 20th century. It was one of the top 3 books when it was written, and it was right up there. All the critics ranked it with The Good Earth. And of course, I've heard of The Good Earth. Of course, I've heard of Pearl Buck and Willa Cather, but I haven't heard of Beth Aldrich. And she was just as famous and just as popular as them, going to the same dinners, being celebrated in the same author circles, and selling as many and sometimes more books than them. Her wholesome, enriching, value-based, inspiring stories have become lost to more modern books. This is what she said or what was said about her approach to writing. Reviews often noted her decency. In a speech, Bess referred to Lantern by quoting from a New York Times review. This is what she said. The success of a book as a lantern in her hand, that's the name of the book, A Lantern in Her Hand, shows that the American people are inherently decent. Here is a book without a single vulgar word in it, characterized by the finest qualities of cleanliness and decency, that has remained consistently upon the bestseller lists. While many shake their heads over present-day looseness of language and subject matter in so much of the fiction published, there is evidence to hand that the American people can take to heart a clean and decent novel. They were just good, clean American people. And these values and ideals were throughout her books. The results of her book were more rewarding than she could have possibly hoped. And in fact, in 1942, it was added to the Modern Literature series for use in classrooms alongside The Red Badge of Courage and The Age of Innocence. Now, it's very worth reading. I would highly recommend you all go grab A Lantern in Her Hand, read it and enjoy it. It doesn't have some of the psychological depth of some other works that are a little bit more my favorites. It is more of an action. I have a video in my principle-centered learning skills course that you can get at audreyrinlisbacher.com. In that course, in that series of lectures, I talk about how to read different genres. And I have a video on how to read short stories, and it's different than novels. Short stories are very action-based, and novels are about character development. And it's not that characters don't change or there aren't valuable lessons, but there's not the same kind of opportunity in a short story for deep psychological character development like there is in a novel. And Bess Aldrich, when she started writing novels, came off of almost 20 years of short story writing. And I don't know if I've only read one of her novels, so I don't know if this is the case with other of her novels. I would guess that one of the reasons that maybe her works didn't last as much is not just the modern novel and the postmodern movement and the change in the way that art critic stuff is done and the shock value of modern and postmodern art and all of that stuff, the redefining of a classic, which I also talk about in principle-centered learning skills. But also the fact that there's a little bit of the short story writer still coming across in the page. And so it's very much a work of action. There are beautiful moments. The main character, Abby, doesn't significantly change. And that's indicative of a short story, not of a novel. And so if I were to give feedback on what I didn't love, it was that there's two things. What I didn't love about it was that there wasn't as much character development as there is in other deeper novels, like Brothers Karamazov was one of my favorites, or Anna Karenina, those kinds of works. So definitely there's not that kind of deep psychological depth and character development and really transformation. Abby Dale is a good woman. She's always a good woman. She goes through hard things. She has some depression. She has hard things. She overcomes them and moves forward. But another thing that wasn't my favorite is that Bess Aldrich's life is a testament to the fact of something that Phyllis Schlafly said that I've always loved, and that is that women can have it all. They just can't have it all at the same time. In other words, we need to be okay with living life in stages, that there's a stage for motherhood when children are small, that we focus and spend our time and attention predominantly with them, and that we baby step. I mean, Bess was writing a lot more when all of her kids were in school than when they weren't. She was 3 or 4, 5 hours at her desk while her son napped and played. It was very different when she was having to provide as a single mom, and all the time that they were at school, she was writing and all of that kind of thing. And so her life is a testament to the fact that you can make space for things that you love. And especially in a modernized world like we have today, even if you're going to work, you can gain skills in your spare time that will help you to change that work. And I'm not trying to belittle anyone who feels stuck or say, whatever. I'm just trying to empower you. Like, if you get serious about transforming your situation and about finding ways to use your gifts to even earn money, if that's what you need, like Bess had done, you can find a way. You can find a way. And if you'll meet your needs better, and if you'll engage in self-discovery, which we do in the Mission to Mom Academy, that could be helpful to you. And so there's this kind of theme throughout the book that Abby was very talented. She had an awesome voice. She was a great artist, but she never was willing to take even the smallest amount of time for those things. There's this thread throughout the book where I'm too old. I'm too old. There's this moment where she decides to try writing, and she writes something and she's really proud of herself, and she goes back and reads it and she instantly gives it up. Oh, I'm not a writer. I can't do it. Instead of, how could I be a good writer? How and getting better at it and finding ways. Now, there are times when she sacrifices as a mother, and it's beautiful. And there's an opportunity for art lessons, and she gives that opportunity to her daughter instead of taking it herself. On the other hand, she could have learned surrogately through her daughter. There could have been a theme in the book where she took 1 hour a week to sit with her daughter and learn what her daughter had learned and practice on her own in those few spare minutes that she had. But she's constantly telling herself, I can't do it. I can't do it. And so she's an incredible mother, and being a mother is her glory. And it is a tribute to pioneer mothers. But it still felt incongruent to me when Bess Aldrich lived out, you can be involved in the community and have 4 children and have a happy home and still carve out a little bit of time to do the thing you love. But then her character could not. But of course, what I love the most is this message of the value of motherhood and overcoming hardship and continuing to not allow herself to get stuck in the mire of depression and resentment. There are many times in the book where Abby gets sucked into depression and resentment, and she pulls herself out. It's really admirable. Here's a few of my favorite quotes from the book. She tells her husband, you have to dream things out. It keeps a kind of an ideal before you. You see it first in your mind, and then you set about to try to make it like that ideal. Of course, we have the Mother's Vision masterclass, which we spent a whole day diving into that. I love the concept of envisioning, of dreaming big, of setting before yourself where you want to get to and being intentional moving toward that. I think that is totally the way to live. There's a moment when Abby had already been through many difficult things. Grasshoppers destroyed her crops that year. And here's what she says: God, you ought to help. We can't do it alone. You ought to help. So she cries out to God. And then through the narrative, Bess tells us this: all through August, Abby went about in a dull, stupid way, depressed by the hard luck that had descended upon them and the knowledge that her 4th child was coming. She got angry at her children and sometimes yelled at them or spanked them. And she was sorry, bitter, and overwhelmed. She began to allow her love for her husband and her babies to begin slipping. And then back to the book, it says, and then in a sudden revelation of feeling at her disloyalty to motherhood, she thought, oh, I don't want to feel that way about a child. I ought not to say that. I won't. I never will again. And she doesn't. She does not let resentment overtake her. She overcomes it and realizes, I need to continue to live in love. Another quote: it takes faith and courage and love and prayer and work and a little singing to keep up your spirits, but we are going to do it. And then there's this moment where she has 2 daughters who don't have children. So one of them is the musician who they helped get all of these music lessons, and she's talented, and she goes to music school and she marries a musician, and she comes to her mother at one point and says, we both want to be musicians and we're always going to be poor, so we've decided we're not going to have children. And Abby's just shocked. She says, we're never going to be able to afford children, so we're not going to have any. And this is from the book. She says to her daughter, if people waited to be rich to have children, you can't afford it. How can you afford to miss it? How can you afford to miss motherhood? So I would say grab a lantern in her hand and let us know, what do you think of it? But in the meantime, Bess has written this huge bestseller. It's gotten a ton of attention. It's brought in some good money. She's riding high, but unfortunately, it brings about her greatest low. She was probably this is a biographer says she was probably at the lowest point in her career. Lantern had been such a great and surprising success that the pressure to write up to its stature seems to have been taking its toll. So she just feels shut down. There's several points in the biography where she talks about writing to people and saying, I'm written out. I don't have any creative ideas. I don't know where to go from here. And the pressure to make money and the pressure to write another book that was going to be as great as this. And her son made a comment at one point about how when she was involved in a project, it totally consumed her and it really wore her out. She wouldn't take breaks. She would just go push, push, push. And so like Lantern in Her Hand had been 19 months of just nonstop and wore her out. And so she would get really worn out and she kind of hit this low and didn't know where to go from here. But she did go on to write more novels. She found her voice again. Those novels were huge bestsellers. She met a lot of famous authors in her day. She met the president's wife, Mrs. Roosevelt. She wrote about the Depression, the hardships that her readers could identify with. She continued to defend the small town. She continued to write about the pioneers and traditional values, strong character, and patriotism. I wanted to tell you a little bit about what her home life was like as a single mom raising her children. It's amazing that she's championing these virtues, but she was also quite progressive. It says, her children were a great source of joy for her, full of laughter and fun and rarely causing her concern. She and Mary shared a close mother-daughter relationship. She often discussed her writing with Mary, frequently having Mary critique a story before it was sent to a publisher. It goes on, their mother's high expectations of them kept them from getting into serious disagreements with one another, for it was simply not done in their family. She did not lecture the youngsters about morals or proper behavior, but when others erred, she would take occasion to comment to the children that she knew none of you would do something like that. To be a member of Bess Aldrich's household meant pancakes or waffles on a cold winter's morning, dinner of baked or fried chicken, or the family favorite meatloaf, which the children all agreed they could never get enough of. It meant conversations about national as well as local events. It meant attending Sunday school and church, and it meant reading. There's also a couple anecdotes with her children that I felt like were really telling of the kind of woman that she was, because you would think, oh, well, she's all about these virtues. She must like be this stuffy old woman, but actually not. So this will probably surprise you. She had a son who was very artistic. In fact, he went on to draw a lot of the book jackets for her books. He was engrossed in art by the time he was 17, drawing in every spare moment. He was the quietest and most introverted of her sons. As he became more proficient as an artist, he hung pictures of nudes in his bedroom and practiced drawing them. Despite her Victorian upbringing, Bess did not fuss or have him take them down, for she recognized his talent and his insatiable desire to learn. So she allowed him to practice drawing these nudes that were hung up in his room. She had a son who went out and bought a motorcycle without telling her. And the first day he rode it home, he did so with both pride and trepidation. He knew his mother wouldn't like it. She didn't, but he knew he would bring her around, and he did. It was brought around the neighborhood and they had a good time riding on it. And so you can see that she's not like what you would think. It's really quite amazing. To wind up this mission-driven story about Bess Aldrich, I want to tell you probably my favorite story about her. She really is such an amazing woman. All through the pages of this biography, a lot of this, there's pretty much only this one by Carol Miles Peterson that I was able to find. She's just kind of this lost heroine. You can go see her property. It's been turned into a museum, but it's not heavily traversed because she's not on reading lists in our modern day. Just like I was unfamiliar with her, but such beautiful books, such beautiful stories. It will give you some really awesome history about the 1800s and into the turn of the century. And her stories are collected into books. And there are some things that this author mentioned I searched online I wasn't able to find. And a lot of the book is about summaries of her novels and things, and that wasn't as important to me as just getting to know her as a person, but there's a lot about her as a person. She just was so solid in what she knew and what she believed and who she was, and confident, and she just faced life, went through hard things, and just admire her so much. She kind of erases the excuses that we would make, because now we have all these conveniences in our modern day. So the time that we would spend making food and doing laundry and caring for the home, we don't spend nearly that time. And, I have several friends who even have housekeepers come clean their homes. And so there is time for us to develop our talents and to use them to bless others. Writing was her avenue. Writing was the way that she reached people, that she touched them, that she inspired them, that she built their faith, that she helped them want to be better. And it worked. She was super popular for a long time. But there's one particular story that I really loved. I'm going to read a little bit about it for you, because the author says it so well, that I think it's just amazing. So here she is. She's had some success with her books, but she's still, they would be very successful and she would get paid on them. But then, and as they accrued, she would have more and more cumulative income. But she's putting a bunch of children through college, and she needs the money and she needs retirement. And so she needs to keep having income and feeling the pressure that way. So we know she wasn't super wealthy and super well off, and she's still putting her children through college, and the Depression hits. FDR is elected. It's January 33. And in March, FDR orders the nation's banks to close for a week. And this is what happens. She was deeply distressed over the likelihood of the bank closing, for not only was she one of the 3 stockholders, she also understood how much pain and grief this would cause her sister and her brother-in-law, the Cobbs, as well as her Elmwood community of neighbors and friends. She realized she was probably the one person who could prevent this imminent financial disaster, in which every depositor would lose money. Those who had mortgages could lose farms or homes. So if the bank closed for a week and they didn't have sufficient funds to reopen, then they were closed permanently. And she wasn't sure they were solvent enough for that to happen. She was really worried that it would cause people to lose their homes. Bess determined what she must do to save her bank and community, and she went to Lincoln, the city of Lincoln, to see George W. Woods, the state banking department chief from 1929 to 1934. Woods later described their meeting. Bess came to him and said, "At present, I am trying to write a book, but I cannot go on with it. You do not know the amount of income and savings I have had. I suspect they are larger than you suppose. But if it takes all to the last cent I have, I shall not permit that bank to close. If you will state the amount of cash necessary to keep the bank open at this time, I will have it ready for you within a few days. If more shall be required later, I will furnish it." Single mom, putting kids through college in the middle of the Depression, who's writing books and hopes they will be successful, who has been very frugal and saved a lot of money, now brings it to save her community. It's like fiction. It's so incredible. It's hard to believe that she would be willing to make this sacrifice. And she just realized, I'm a stockholder. I don't want it to fail. It's a life's work for me and my husband. And I am probably the only one with enough savings and in a position to do anything about it. She went to her tin box, as she called it, and cashed in sufficient securities and jewelry to cover the deficit. The bank did not fail. Her only stipulation, this is amazing too, her only stipulation was that her assistance not be made public during her lifetime, a request that both Woods and the newspaper honored. No one had any idea that she had made this sacrifice. With the bank secure, Aldrich was able to finish her book, and by the middle of June, had it in the publisher's offices. On August 25th, 1933, Miss Bishop was published. That's the one that became a book later. However, the money expended in keeping the bank solvent had cost Aldrich dearly. She had to write for royalties checks in advance, and she had never had to request help. She had to pay back those advances eventually. So, to wrap this up, I want to check in on the 7 Laws of Life mission, because this is a mission-driven story. And Bess Streeter Aldrich was a mission-driven woman. Law 1, loving God and establishing her divine center. Absolutely loved God. You can see that all throughout. She leaned on him when times got especially hard. She was faithful. She obeyed, lived according to his laws and principles, was a very godly person, set an incredible example, and kept hope and optimism through hard times. And she has that theme with her characters, that times will get better and that there's still always hope. Law 2, loving herself, is striving for self-mastery. She definitely took care of her own needs and took responsibility for herself. From the start, she got a great education and she was engaged in self-discovery. Those 3 principles that we talk about of meeting your needs, taking responsibility, and engaging in self-discovery, you can see those throughout her life. She showed up for herself, for her family, and for her community because she met those needs. She used her money to free up her time. She wasn't afraid. I mean, I've had hangups about that. She developed her talent, and then she used her money to free up her time so that she could do what was most important and continue to do what she loved and be there for her children. They all got college educations and opportunities because of this. She loved it and leaned into it and became great at it. She definitely strove for that self-mastery, and she woke up and she went to work and she made herself do those things, and it paid off. She loved truth. She lived according to true principles. Because they were living financial principles when her husband died, she wasn't totally destitute. She was able to stay in her home and able to keep her stock in the bank because she had developed her talent and used it to get help. She developed her talent even more and developed and established all these relationships with editors. And she was able to begin to tap into that. Those financial principles that she learned, she obviously took very good care of herself and her property. She lived parenting principles. She made sure she was always there for her children. And even if she worked, it was next to her children in the home with them running around her if that was what it took. She didn't cave to societal pressure. She kept her books elevated, focusing on values with no swearing and high ideals and men and women of character, teaching the good and the true and the beautiful. She was dedicated to historical accuracy and truth just in her storytelling. She wouldn't be pushed to publish before she knew that what she had written in her books was true. She was dedicated to truth in all ways and tried to encourage her children to live according to true principles. And she was a true servant leader. She risked everything to save the bank and her community, even her own financial stability and her retirement. She was keep holding that money away because she had nobody else. She didn't have a husband providing income. She had to lean entirely on herself. I mean, her children would help her, obviously, but she was trying to create her own retirement. As a single mom and full-time author, it was everything to her to take that risk. She was a devoted mother, a faithful friend, an active member of the community. She was a servant leader everywhere. She didn't take a lot of accolades for the work. I mean, if you read her biography, she stayed humble, just like on the day that she was going to write her book, and she was given an honorary doctorate, and she was asked to speak so many places and sign tens of thousands of books and so many great reviews from critics, and it could have gone to her head, but she remained humble all her life. And then, of course, 5 through 7, hearing the call, courageously executing and doing it again and again. She heard the calls of motherhood, community service, and writing, and that's what her life revolved around. And anytime something needed to be done, she checked in to see if she could become part of that, if she could participate in any good work, and she did. She was not perfect, fell into depression at times and struggled and all of those things like we all do. Wasn't the perfect mom, wasn't the perfect woman, but is so admirable, so amazing. It really was an honor to learn about her. I'm so grateful to my friend for telling me about her, and kudos to her. If you have other mission driven stories you think I need to tell, other men and women whose lives reflect the good, the true, and the beautiful, who you see those 7 laws of life mission emulated in their life choices and activities, I would love to hear about them. I want to keep doing these regularly. They inspire me, and I've heard from many of you that they inspire you. So I hope this was a very inspiring podcast today, that you enjoyed learning about her as much as I did. You can grab her biography if you'd like, A Lantern in Her Hand. You can go watch Cheers for Miss Bishop if you'd like some good, wholesome cinema from 1941, and then read any and all of her books. You'll have a delightful time. Thank you so much for joining me today. If this has been helpful, please pass it along to a friend, subscribe, like, and leave a podcast review. That helps others find us and know what they can expect to hear on this podcast. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next time.